So we know one of the great things that Verdi was capable of doing was writing symphonic music, the kind of which the world had never seen, had never heard. And he is, even today, of course, considered to be the greatest composer of all time. So what we're going to learn today then is all of the various aspects of the changes that were taking place at the time in the mid 1850s or so, when he began his career in earnest, how his life became intertwined with the Jewish world, and why is it that he chose to write the music for Nabucco? Because Nabucco was a unique kind of experience. It was a story about Jewish people who are slaves, and opera had not ever in years past been written about people who are completely powerless and are at the lowest level of the social scale. Of course, one of the great things that he did for the Jewish world when he wrote an opera about the Jewish captivity in Babylon is that he essentially said that the sorrows and the pains and the life experience of Jews was equal to the life of the once great Holy Roman Empire. This did a great deal for this elevation of not only the biblical story, but the trials and tribulations that Jewish people have gone through throughout history and survived. So, as I said, what is the role that an artist plays in society? This is something we should always be looking for when we look at a piece of art, because they're making an argument, as I said. We will see then how many of these roles that Verdi played. He was a man that wanted to help Italy become unified and throw off the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the French Empire that had taken possession of Italy at certain junctures in history. He was also a realist that understood it was very important to do this kind of thing, though it might be considered treasonous. It's not something that goes unnoticed by the powers that be. When you make a story about people that want to be free and the Italian people want to be free, you can see that there is a direct correlation. Therefore, it could easily be considered treasonous. So you have to try to very fine line. What is it that this man did? He did many things. This is the reason why the role that he played had such a huge impact on not only people that are completely powerless and people who have no way to dictate their life experience because they're being controlled by others who are far more powerful. Then it becomes a story that is the quintessential representation of that period in time in history. It's known as Romanticism. And we'll see in a few moments how this was taken up. The philosophy of Romanticism was taken up by the humanities and made it definable for the average person. After all, I think all of us are very well aware of the fact that the stories that we tell, the novels that we write, are always changing because possibilities for people's choices in life, in particular women's, let's say, who have always been sort of held down by laws that were in place. Today, you can see that the world is completely open for women, and more women are taking important positions in government, etc. So the novels and the stories that we tell, the art pieces that we make, are representations of change. So now let's look directly, though, at opera. Opera has two significant categories. One of them is known as opera buffa, where we get the word buffoon, and opera seria. So opera buffa is comic. It's for the common man, and this style of opera depicts everyday people with problems that are common to them and therefore common to us. The libretto, or the little book, the dialogue was written to be understood by an uneducated audience, Stock characters were adopted from commedia dell'arte that were easily recognizable by their customers or people that were watching these shows that were typically sort of vaudeville style shows. And people were defined by their costumes and kind of the gibberish talk that they put on, like Sid Caesar did 60, 70 years ago when he pretended to be speaking Japanese, but we know he didn't say one discernible word that was in that language. So opera buffa, you can recognize everywhere because of the way that the body postures are positioned and the kind of the comical way that people are shown in these scenes tell us right away this is going to be a comedy, and a comedy that kind of has this haywire aspect to it, in the same way that the Marx Brothers does the very same thing. We know that when Groucho Marx plays Rufus T. Firefly in the country of Fredonia, there's going to be a lot of shenanigans that will take place. Another thing that is kind of interesting and consequential to know about opera buffa is that it's largely centered around two lovers that can't be together. But as you know, this is also a great part of opera seria. And there would be no opera if there were not the subject of love that's introduced to it, because love creates its own unique problems in life. So what happens is we have this story of the innamorati. So they are the lovers that are being kept away from each other, from other people that are interested, say, in gaining the monetary value of a dowry, or people standing in their way for various reasons. And they are the ones that are that have their own designations. So let's just look at for a moment here what happens in the modern world. He is an innamorato. He is the lover man. She is the innamorata. The mother is a zany. She's the zany one. And he is the man that is trying to hold the conservative family view, because his interest is to keep everything calm, and he has the name of the vecchio. He's preventing anything from happening that is untoward in his mind. These young people getting together and becoming these liberal political children that are living in his house. Here we can see what is happening is these traditional costumes will always represent the clown, the harlequin. He is Figaro in The Barber of Seville. We also have Pantalone, who always is shown in red. He is the old miser that tries to marry the young girl, not because he's interested in her romantically, but because he wants to grow his wealth. And then we have Il Dottore. Il Dottore is the representation of someone that blows a lot of hot air and throws around a lot of Latin words, but none of them are correct. Now, years ago, I had a perfect modern day representation of Il Dottore, but since this is inappropriate, and perhaps this is inappropriate with Congress's pompous characters full of hot air, perhaps just to be safe, what we can say is the lukewarm version of this is the doctor's Crane, and perhaps that Eddie was the smartest one in the whole bunch. The Pantalone figure is adopted, of course, by Jack Benny, the miser, the famous miser on television. And here we see sort of these combination characters that all come to us in modern times from over 900, 1,000 years ago. He's somewhat of a clever clown, but he can get things done. She, of course, is a very clever clown. She gets everything done. She makes everything okay for everyone. These two are the ones that make it okay for the lovers to get together because they work sort of behind the scenes, and they are the essentially powerless people that are very crafty. And then, of course, we have the pompous man that makes it possible for them to live in a mansion on Park Avenue, but he's a dullard. And she is the one that's always finagling to get him. She is, again, one of these characters that is a manipulator from the Commedia dell'arte. None of this, of course, is done with evil intent. It's done so that everything works out okay, because in Commedia dell'arte, no one dies. In these kind of buffa, opera buffa, nobody gets hurt, which is completely different than opera seria. Opera seria was entertainment that was performed for the noble class. The plot lines were originally adopted from ancient cultures, Greek and Roman myths, biblical stories, and later adaptations of novels and popular plays like Madame Butterfly and La Traviata. So what we see that happens is, of course, that opera seria is meant to go on for many acts. In fact, there used to be 5 acts in a play. It could go on in an opera, that is, it could go on for many, many hours. And the 3rd act was always a full ballet that was an interpretation of what had gone on in Act 1 and 2. Well, this is for the noble class because the noble class didn't work, and they stood up and, stayed up all hours of the night having dinner in between. And the stories then reflected their lives. They reflected their power. But at the same time, an opera can only be an opera if it has these kind of sort of fatal aspects to it. Because if there's not love and there's not fatal love, you don't have a dramatic story. And opera is nothing but drama. So this story of Lucia di Lammermoor is the story of a noble Scottish family. And of course, it would include the requisite emotions of power and love and betrayal and madness and death. And that's one thing that we know for sure, is many, many people are going to die in serious operas, because when you betray people, when you act deceitful, when there's tragedy and revenge and suicide involved in a play, then you know that the suicide is as a result of cleansing the story, because this is the way we tell stories in the West. We must cleanse the story in the end and return everything to its rightful place. And everyone that is bad must be punished, and everyone that is good must be rewarded. And in that way, you have a catharsis. So catharsis is a Greek word. And the reason that we tell stories is that we have been influenced by Greek tragedy, by Greek theater. So that, say, in the case of Titian painting this during the Renaissance, where there was a revival of all things Greek and Roman, clearly we can see one of the things he's doing is telling us one of these fables that comes from the Greek myths. And he has a great opportunity to paint a nude. We'll talk about this some other time. The woman doesn't have to be nude, but she's nude. Again, very interesting why this has to be done in this way. In any case, even say in the 1870s with the Victorian artist, the pre-Raphaelites, she is held up in chains as a prisoner. We see that the damsel in distress that is going to be freed by the knight. And at this time, there's kind of this interest in this classical motifs of knights and damsels and all of these various crisis points in history in which young men become so powerful and elite because they become these great warriors. Well, I'll tell you what, although these stories go back thousands of years, they are always repeated, always, because it's a formula that works. Now, where opera started is typically when there are art forms that experience inventions or innovations, or they're being brought to life in general. This happens during a time typically where there is a booming economy. If there's a lot of money, there's money for warfare, there's money for culture. Actually, quite often when these booms take place, war is abated, so that the money is not always funneled toward the war effort, and consequently there's more to put toward the arts. However, in Florence in the 1500s, I think both of these aspects were going on, and the Renaissance became this rebirth of European culture because there was a lot of interest in elevating the society through cultural presentations and through showing the world how very prominent the Italian Florentine Peninsula at this point, or the Florentine province, I should say, at this point, the city-state is enormously wealthy, but the other Italian city-states will also be doing very well because of the location of Italy. That too is a big story. However, today what we can say is this: the House of Medici became a prominent procurer and supporter of the arts because they were lending money by charging interest. This was considered a big sin in the Italian world. And so they began to use a lot of their money for the improvement architecturally, artistically, and in every other way to make Florence this enormous capital of art, humanities, and wealth. Well, this is the family crest of the Medici family. It shows you that this represents the fleur-de-lis is the home bank in Florence. And these are like six, but I mean five, but there will be 6 or 7 more banks, even as far away, by the way, as Alexandria, Egypt, where they will be enormously wealthy, one of the wealthiest families in the world at this time. So one of the things that they oversaw among, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, et cetera, is the Florentine Camerata that was interested in music, because one of the ways the Renaissance came to life is that the Medici family and other people that were competing with them for their same position were sending scholars all over the world where there were monasteries and wherever information was kept about the ancient world. They were translating it into a modern Italian from Latin and Greek. And one of the things that they found out about the Greek world in particular was that music was everywhere. Music was something that was a big part of going to the agora, to the market, to buy corn seeds, God knows wherever people went, whether it was Olympics or it was theater or it was outside communing with nature, there was always music. So one of the things that they did is they got together with Mr. Greenberg here, Mr. Claudio Monteverdi. They got together with him, who was already a great composer of all kinds of music that was popular at this time, like ballads and love songs and, all of this, because people were now paying for entertainment at home. So there was music that had to be provided that was of a secular nature, as opposed to church music, because it's a different venue, obviously. So what happens with Claudio Monteverdi, when they ask him to write a story that will include music in it, so that they can try to experience what is it about the Greek world that made music such an integral part of everyday existence. Well, being that he was a musicologist and composer, what he did was he chose to tell a story about the greatest musician in Greek myths, and his name was Orfeo. And of course, since Orfeo is already known for sort of soothing the savage beast with his beautiful singing and music, then a story that is a musical about the god of music is a pretty good story. Now, what happens in the story, what makes it tragic, is that he falls in love with a young woman called Eurydice, or Eurydice, depending on which language. And Eurydice and he are engaged to be married. And while she's showing her ring off to all of her little girlfriends, she's not paying attention to the fact that there's a poisonous snake right by her foot, which bites her and kills her. When she dies, then she has to go to the underworld, to Hades. And when she's there, Orfeo is so desperate to take her out of Hades and bring her into the living world again, that Pluto, who is guarding the gates of Hades, says to him, I can't let you in. It's never been done before. No one has ever left the underworld. And so Orfeo begins to sing and he breaks down Pluto's resolve. What happens, though, of course, is that Pluto says to him, you must take her and spirit her out quickly. And you cannot turn around. You simply go forward. You take her forward. And that's it. If she turns around for a moment, she's lost to you forever. Well, because it has to be a tragedy, she has to turn around and he loses her forever. So this becomes, and there's a lecture on the beginning of opera anyway that I do that is quite interesting. But, and of course, the story is far more extensive, but the point is, it becomes this fundamentally unique period in history where a work that becomes known as an opera is the first time staged in the Italian world, where there's a band and where there are singers and performers that are doing this kind of show where you're singing the whole time that people would normally be speaking. And then the aria is the monologue in the opera. That is the, excuse me, not the aria is the confessional that someone tells you what is inside their heart, as you would have this kind of private monologue in a play. So,
excuse me a second, Bela, I just want to insert that the Metropolitan Opera on December the 4th is doing your Massenet's opera, and it's in the movies. It's a high definition.
Oh, lovely. Okay, thank you. We'll talk about that at the end.
All over the country.
Okay, sweetheart, we'll talk about that in the end. That's a good thing to have on our calendar. All right, so now what we have is this kind of this becomes the definition for what an opera looks like. People sing rather than speak. And quite naturally, why is it that even opera was born in Italy? It's born in Italy because when you say good morning in Italian, you are already singing. It is a natural, an absolute natural. So when you say buongiorno amore mio, you're already singing. And when you have a vowel and a consonant and a vowel and a consonant one after another, your voice can go up and down. And when it goes up, you can take in a breath of air. On top of everything else, as you can see, there is every word ends in a vowel. And because every word ends in a vowel, they will also have to shorten Nebuchadnezzar's name to Nabucco. Otherwise, what rhymes with Nebuchadnezzar? Never mind orange. What rhymes with Nebuchadnezzar? So because every word ends in a vowel, it's easy to write poetic poetry. I guess that's actually repetitive, but it's you're able to write poetry that's melodious because the words can rhyme so easily and they permit you to breathe. Another, of course, big question is, why is it that they would have written a play at this time about Jewish slaves? Well, Jewish slaves are going to be written about because of the various changes that are going to be documented in the art world. And many of the changes that begin to happen is in the Baroque era. So we have the Renaissance, which lasts 200 to 300 years. We have the Baroque era, which lasts maybe 150 years. Then we have the Age of Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, around the beginning of the 1700s. And what this purports to, or proposes, I should say, and what its goal is to present opportunities for the average man, because the call to arms under the Age of Reason is that all men are created equal and that governments should work for the benefit of mankind as opposed to a handful of people at the top. In the Jewish world, this is known as the Haskalah, and the man that is the leader of the Haskalah for the Jews is Moses Mendelssohn. And for the French, it's Rousseau and Voltaire. In the United States, it's our founding fathers. So what happens to bring this to light, as I said, how you tell philosophy for the average man is in a novel. This is how you tell someone how change is happening, because in this story, we have a white man from England, the most powerful country in the world at this time, and a black man who together have to support each other to survive. So both of them are equal because both of them must help each other survive the trip back to England. And of course, trying not to get eaten up by pygmies as well. So the signing of the Constitution of the United States created a moment which was such an enormous revolution worldwide that what happens just 13 years later is we have the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, again, is signaling that people are no longer interested in the well-fed, having these luxurious and absurd lives while people are dying in the streets of hunger. And when you have the deposition and the guillotine that is going to kill the king and queen at this moment, you will have initially a democratic leader that wants to bring peace, harmony, and democracy to the French world. But when he is not re-elected, he decides to crown himself emperor. When he crowns himself emperor, well, we know what is happening here. He is essentially now the king. He is the king of the French world in everything but name. And he's crowning Josephine his empress. And because he's a young man who wants to take over the world, he simply marches into Madrid in 1808, and he has hired the best soldiers in the world who don't even get off their horses, these Turks that have this scythe that lops people's heads off if they come trying to attack them. And those people that were the innocents that stood up to Napoleon's army, who you can see as this Christ figure with the stigmata on his palms, Napoleon's soldiers are going to mow them down at sunup. Was this revulsion toward the Napoleonic Wars and the excesses of the French Revolution and everything else that happened created a moment in the art world where those that were making art were attempting to say, we no longer respect man-made institutions like political systems that keep certain people in and others out, educational systems that let certain people in and keep most people out, these kind of marital rights in which dowries and money is always held at the top when, say, the Whitneys and the Vanderbilts intermarry, etc. All of these man-made institutions, including church, we no longer hold dear. But we do need God, and God lives in nature. This became known as the era of Romanticism, where nature and the natural man, the farmer, the man that was least likely to have political or economic power because he is a man that lives off the land and he doesn't know anyone in Congress. So what happens here is we start to have this unique moment in which, say, originally, the kind of paintings that were always made were history paintings, and they would have been history paintings of people that are important and consequential in the world. But now with this new era of Romanticism, these history paintings became known as documents of terrible and treacherous things that had gone awry when, say, in the case of the raft of the Medusa, we have people that were the lower class, the crew, that were set adrift on one of the walls of the ships, the great ship that went down, because all of the men with shiny buttons and velvet jackets took the lifeboats. Now you begin to see a different kind of history painting. It's a history painting of where the government is shown with a critical eye. And in addition to that, you begin to see these kind of heroic paintings of men that are fighting for liberty in France, say in the 1830s, even young boys brandishing guns, excuse me. You can see that these men are fighting. They don't even have a proper uniform, but they're all fighting for freedom. And this figure of the Statue of Liberty, or the, this statue associated with even the Venus de Milo, what happens here is you have then this association with history and how the common man is being elevated to a status of appropriate place. After all, these are the people that feed the whole nation. And in this way, you can see that the novels that were written to elevate women as well. You have to tell women that they can be good and kind and considerate, and they will be rewarded by marrying this scoundrel. But this scoundrel is going to have his comeuppance in the end. At the same time, we have the stories in which impoverished orphans also have a place in a book. And even those women that have to make their living on their back are elevated to a status of respectability. She is practically angelic in all this white. And who are the roués? The ones that, though he tried to marry her foolishly thinking his family would permit him to do so, and his father, who definitely will not. So you can see what happens here in the 1800s. It is otherwise known as the democratization of the European continent. Stories are told about people that are average, everyday people living under oppressive governments, and they have to contravene all of these terrible circumstances and dangerous circumstances with having their social acuity do the work for them. They have to do it in a way that's kind and sweet because they don't want to get their head knocked off. And of course, when we know that toward the end of this era that is known as the Reconstruction era of the 1800s, when you begin to elevate slaves to the point in which they are the only truly noble character in the whole book, he too, of course, is noble, but he uses a lot of tactics that we normally wouldn't, like stealing and lying, but he is the purest of pure men. Well, you have someone like Verdi to thank for that, because you see, he elevated the status of slaves. Now, when Verdi was born in the Italian world, he was born in this region of, in this general area here, and Napoleon had created such strong alliances in the European world that he controlled so much of it with family in place, and these kind of alliances that clever men do. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was not under Napoleon's control. They were able to fight him off. However, they did take over, as you can see, the whole continent of Italy. By the time that Verdi is born, actually, his birth certificate is written in French. And we have the man who comes from Corsica, which is closely aligned, say, with Italy, is the Emperor of France. Now, Verdi is born in Roncole, a little town, Roncole. Later, he's going to move to Busseto, which is a slightly bigger city. His father has a general store on the first floor, and the family lives here. His parents are completely uneducated, and they come from this, as I said, this general area here. And what happens with Verdi is it becomes known quickly in the little town very close to Roncole, where the family, the parents and he will move, and I believe there's a little sister as well. They're going to move here. By the time that Verdi is 9 years old, he's already playing the organ here. And at the age of 13, he's the assistant conductor of the Busseto Orchestra. But the man that is going to make his future in every way imaginable is this man by the name of Antonio Barezzi. This statue of Verdi celebrating 200 years stands in front of his home. He was a wealthy merchant who was in every way imaginable a father figure for Verdi. And this home where Verdi came to live off and on, and where they had recitals for him as a young man, is a place that is today open to tourists. And Barezzi paid for Verdi to go to La Scala so that he could be educated there in the school that has music and dance and stagecraft and so on, even today, I believe, for future composers and musicians. But they said he had no talent and that he should study with a private person. Being that Verdi was a man that could hold on to a grudge, even 30 years after he became a world-renowned composer, he refused to conduct an opera at La Scala. I think in the 31st year, he did deign to do so. However, what happens with this wonderful man is that he pays for everything, and he even permits Verdi to marry his lovely daughter. His lovely daughter and he are 22, 23 years old, and she and he are over the moon happy. Verdi does get a commission to write an opera seria, which includes all of the required high dramatic, songs that would go along with high dramatic emotions. His wife dies, and 2 children that she has born die just a few months before. So within 4 years, he's a widower that has lost everything. And if this were not sad enough that he's writing this opera seria, which he hasn't quite finished, but he was contracted to do 2 more prior to this date, and one of them was an opera buffa. And this ridiculous opera that he wrote here is staged in honor of his early career. However, it is not considered a great piece of work, and at the same time, the man is absolutely dying of grief. Now, I was introduced to Karl Haas in the 1980s, and he was telling a story right around Rosh Hashanah in which he said that Verdi was so distraught because of the loss of his family, that he couldn't sleep at night. He was so depressed that he only sometimes slept in the day. He was walking around like a dead man. His wife died in June, and he began to walk the streets of Milan, where he heard cantors that were practicing for Rosh Hashanah solos, prayers. And when he heard the kind of mournful, pleading, entreating emotions in their work, I'm not sure that we're going to have a moment to listen to Jocelyn Rosenblatt, but he is the Caruso of the Jewish world. And this is the kind of prayer that he would have heard the cantor pleading with God to protect his fellow Jews. Well, let's just listen for a moment, though it's so hard to turn off. So I have friends who have said to me, is there only just one Jewish opera, Nabucco? And I say, no, there's a Jewish opera that goes on every Friday night. The cantor singing is the Jewish opera. But what happens with Verdi is, because he becomes so interested in why these prayers are so penetrating and mournful, he knows that the Jews have always had a difficult time, but he begins to get this very deep education related to why is it the Jews are so desperate to be protected, and he begins to learn about the Babylonian diaspora. When initially the Assyrian Empire, which will later be taken over by the Babylonian Empire and so on and so forth, that 10 tribes of Israel were taken there first in 700 BCE, and then they became the property of the Assyrians. They became prisoners, slaves. And then during the Persian Empire, which was far larger, they are going to be associated with Nebuchadnezzar, who will come. Actually, it's not Nebuchadnezzar, it's actually Cyrus, but Cyrus also doesn't rhyme with anything. So when they choose Nebuchadnezzar and name him Nabucco, we have an opera that is going to tell the story of the Persians permitting the Jews to go back to rebuild their second temple. And we know that the Wailing Wall are the fortification walls of the second temple. Now, what is so essential to understand, of course, is because Verdi was born at this particular time when the United States was looking like he's born right at the time when the US is about 25 years old. And the stories of the American Revolution, where underfed, underclothed, underarmed soldiers who are farmers take up arms against the strongest military machine in the world, and they win. That's the story that's told. And the fact that the Italians in the 1840s and 50s already know that the Turks were pushed out of Greece and the Greeks took over their country again. Well, there's the word that we use all the time, empowered the Italian people that something could happen for them. Never mind that there were all kinds of little revolutions taking place everywhere. And primarily here you can see in Italy and Austro-Hungary. In that year of 1848, we have artists starting to make the kind of nationalistic paintings that show Germany to be united. That we show Romanian artists that are trying to say that they themselves want to be nationalistic and have their own leaders, etc. So what we have then is these, in 1848, in Milan, there is an uprising in which the Italians make it known that they want their own country. They want leaders that speak their own language. And like the Jews who went up against the great and glorious, largest empire of its kind, they continued to cry about wanting to return to their homeland. They eventually were permitted over a 23-year period to come back to their country. And because this story of Nabucco was so important to one of the Jewish great merchants and bankers of the Venetian Republic, we start to get money being funneled in to this revolutionary movement, and it will be kicked off by the 1,000 soldiers that will become part of Garibaldi's Risorgimento. So this Risorgimento becomes this resurgence, the Italian revolution, in which they want to unify their country. They want to throw the Austro-Hungarians out of their country that are controlling the northern part of Italy. They want to throw out the remaining French people that are controlling the southern part of Italy. And they want their own unique government and their voice. All of these things always happen at the right time. There is no mistake that happens in the arts. There is no mistake. Everything is planned. Everything is done because everything has purpose. When this man, Solera, had written the libretto, he couldn't find a good composer that suited him well enough until he met Verdi. And he and Verdi together were more and more educated to the history of the Jewish people. His wife died, as I said, some years prior to this, but eventually the woman that is going to sing the most difficult and the most dramatic role, which will be Abigaili, where we get the name Abigail from, she is going to sing the role, the impassioned role of the evil sister in Nabucco, and she will sing it so well that she will literally break her voice, but she will become his second wife and the most integral component of his life, because she, as a young woman from her teen years, had already traveled so many places in the world and knew so many singers and impresarios and everybody, that she was able to help him in every way imaginable. So what does he do? He writes the music for Nabucco, and the themes are all going to be there. The play begins in Jerusalem and ends in Babylon, today Iran. And the opening performance in 1842, when the young men that were building the scaffolds and building the stages, and those people that were sewing the costumes for the upcoming opera, when they heard Va Pensiero, they started to sing it in the streets before anyone ever knew what it was. It was already kind of becoming the unofficial national anthem of the Italian people because it had such a perfect quality to it. But we'll get to that in just a moment. So now what we have is Giuseppe Verdi's Nabucco. It's staged in 1842. It begins in Jerusalem, and Verdi is going to become, by the way, so wealthy as a result of this opera, which is going to be staged everywhere imaginable for years upon years upon years to come, and of course today as well, that this continues to feed a home that he built for musicians, which we will see in just a few moments. But he was able to pay for part of the armies that were fighting in the Italian liberation all over different parts of Italy. That's how wealthy he became. Now, this is the Moses figure, who is the priest Zechariah in the Temple of Jerusalem. And he knows that the Babylonians are coming to Jerusalem with their armies. They're determined to destroy this weaker nation of the Israelites, the Judeans, and that the Solomon's temple will be burned to the ground and people will be taken slaves, and those that resist will be killed and have their heads chopped off. That's how we're introduced to this. And then we're introduced to the good, and evil aspects of this story, and the love triangle that is going to make a big difference and be kind of the motor, the engine for this story that is part of the big historical event. Fanina is the good daughter. Of course, she wears white. Vanina is the good daughter who is being held in the Temple of Jerusalem as a kind of a guarantee that the Babylonians will not attack because she might be killed. This was done everywhere in the ancient world. A prince was often sent so that his father would show the enemy that they do not plan to attack them because his son will die as well. Now, at a certain time, they inform us in this song together that that he at one time was sent to Babylon to ensure the Babylonians that the Jews were not coming to attack them. But what happens at that point is when they first laid eyes on each other, this Romeo and Juliet couple fell in love, and they're still in love. Now, while she is in the temple, they feel like they have some protection. But as these historical and political events are furthered, and this romantic subplot becomes more clear as to what is going to happen, we begin to understand that there is a good sister and a bad sister. She has red hair here, and a bad sister who are both in love with Ismaeli, with the Jewish soldier that was once in their father's castle. Here, what we see is Zechariah, the Jewish priest, threatens to kill Fanina if Nabucco comes toward them and attempts to destroy the temple. And what happens is Ismaili says he will not permit her to be killed because he loves her. So now what happens is that Fanina is much more tied to the Jewish people because she's in love with a Jewish man. So she is seen by the Babylonians as a traitor, and Ismaili is seen as a traitor to the Jews because he says that he will not permit the Babylonians to take Fanina even if they destroy the temple. It's kind of convoluted like that, but in any case, we know what's happening here. The Jewish people are in despair, and the high priest Zechariah tries to assure them in his aria that they will be protected, God will protect them. And no, God is taking care of other business. And as it happens, the Israelites are assaulted, conquered, and subsequently taken to Babylon. Now, what happens then, we begin to understand that Nabucco's oldest daughter, who is the evil one in this story, finds out something that her father already knows, and that is that she was the daughter of a slave. And because she is one of the concubine slaves, she doesn't have the direct lineage to the throne. When Fanina finds this out, then she begins to blackmail her sister and says to her, she'll make everything okay. Of course, she doesn't divulge this information to her sister, the good one, but she tells Fanina that if she lets her have, the bad sister wants to have the Ismaili as hers, if she gives him up, then she will not permit the temple to be destroyed and the Jews. Well, Fanina doesn't agree, Abigail doesn't agree, and so she goes back to Babylon. I think it's something like that. You get the story. King Nabucco and his soldiers take control of Jerusalem. They do what they said, what was always done in the ancient world. They take control, they destroy, they burn the temple, they take the Jews as slaves to Babylon. And in Act 2, then we see the manipulative sister Abigail discovers that she doesn't have this lineage, and she has to keep this secret, and she has to do whatever she can to be sure that this information is not divulged. What happens at this point, there's sort of a supernatural thing that happens in which part of the castle wall or ceiling, I think, breaks, hits the father Nabucco in the head. He's knocked unconscious. His crown falls off his head. She takes the crown. She crowns herself empress. He is unconscious, and she plans to have the Israelites and Fanina killed, and this is what her plan is. Abigail tricks her father into signing a death warrant when he's sort of in and out of consciousness. And eventually, when he realizes he's powerless and he pleads for his daughter's life, who has now converted to Judaism, Abigail, she is unmoved and orders Nabucco to leave. The high priest, that is Babylonian, presents the death warrant for the sister Fanina and for the Jews. And then what happens is that Nabucco learns that he has essentially unwittingly signed his daughter's death certificate. The good daughter is going to be killed. Again, what happens in Babylon stays in Babylon. No, I'm sorry, that's not it. Zechariah assures the Hebrew slaves that their prayers will be answered. They beg for their return to their country, and they say that they will rise up against the Babylonians. And what happens with Nabucco at this juncture is he takes from this 137th Psalm, which is a song about the Jews mocking their captors in Babylon, essentially. But it's a mournful sound that culminates in these feelings of revenge. And at the same time, it highlights their exile and their wish to be returned to Israel. We'll just play a little part of it. Oh.
על נהרות בבל, שם ישבנו גם בכינו, בזוכרנו את ציון, על ערבים בתוכה תלינו, כינורותינו, כי שם
Okay, so these kind of mournful words that are being sung here are going to become the unofficial national anthem, as I said, of the Italian people. It's called Va Pensiero, Go My Thoughts on Golden Wings. As you know, every aria, orchestral piece of this kind, the first words are the name of the aria. All of the words that are included here have deep, deep significance, like homeland, like memories, like the dreams, the lament, the depths, courage. All of these words that are transposed into this Italian song, in which they are telling people that they miss their homeland and that they will be courageous enough to fight for it. So here what we will see, what is even more touching, is not only the words and the songs and everything else, is that the costume designer has covered the singers, the Jewish slaves, in a tallis. So let's hear Go My Thoughts on Golden Wings. They clap for at least 3 minutes. So what I'm going to do is take you to the beginning of the song.
Siccome siamo in un clima molto italico e molto spesso Muti ha parlato ai sordi per tanti anni, facciamo un'eccezione, siamo in casa nostra, no? Nel teatro della capitale, siccome il coro l'ha cantato magnificamente, l'orchestra l'ha accompagnato benissimo, se volete unirvi anche voi lo facciamo tutti insieme.
It don't get better than that. There has never been an opera that has the same meaning for many people in the world. Well, the chorus of the Hebrews then had its unmistakable potency, and Verdi finished the opera before it was even staged. Many people already knew what to expect and couldn't wait to hear it. And it became such an important part of not only the aspect of its liberation component, which could easily have been tagged as treasonous, and certainly the Austro-Hungarian Empire knew full well that it was the story of the Italians. But because people were so affected by it, that it is always played twice. It's the only operatic piece, orchestral piece, that is ever played twice in a row, every single time it's performed. Because when it appeared, when its premiere was, the audience would not stop clapping, yelling, and begging for it to be sung yet again. So in commemoration of that, it is always sung twice. So it was obvious, the highlights, the understanding of what was happening in the world for them was a way to tell this story. And in the final act in the Royal House of Babylon, Nabucco finally awakens. He still suffers from the concussion. He's confused. He's not sure. But when he knows that the older daughter, who is going to attempt to kill his real daughter, I guess you could say, Abigail is exposed as the mastermind of the malicious act. She confesses. She poisons herself. She begs forgiveness. She prays for God's mercy, and she dies by suicide. And then what we have then is Fanina and the Israelite prisoners are not sure what's going to happen to them. They still think that they're going to be killed and sacrificed perhaps, or they don't know what their end will be, until Nabucco comes in and asks all of them for their forgiveness. He promises to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. He even promises to convert to Judaism if his prayers are answered. And miraculously, his strength and reason are immediately restored. Loyal soldiers enter to release the people that should be free, and then the traitors are punished. Well, we can all have this glorious catharsis in which everything is well with the world again. This is the opera that made my artistic career. I had many difficulties to fight against it. It is certain that Nabucco was born under a lucky star. There is not one Italian that does not know the words to Va Pensiero. What happens in the end, of course, is because Verdi will go from strength to strength and become this unquestionably, arguably, the greatest composer of all time. He will become inordinately wealthy. He will live better than some of the kings in European capitals. And he will have an enormous estate with a working farm. He will also have a 40-50-year relationship with Giuseppina Stroponi. She will live 82 years, and he will live even beyond those years. I believe he lives 88 years. The Casa di Riposo is still in operation today. It was built for the purpose of supporting impoverished elderly musicians. In 1901, over 300,000 people walked the streets of Milan just to get a glimpse of his funeral cortege. Some hours before he died, lying, I believe, in a hotel that was outfitted as a hospital room, the police put hay on the streets so that he would get a little bit of peace and quiet from the hoofs hitting the streets and the noise outside. This happens to be just a 1-minute long silent film of his funeral. Now, if I were to ask you, which roles do you think Verdi played